He thought she was dead to him. 5 years of silence, 5 years of building walls so thick no one could reach him. And then she walked through that ballroom door like a ghost wearing a red dress. Adrian Vale, a man who had dismantled corporations and buried enemies without flinching, felt his chest lock up the moment he saw her. Elena Cross, his ex-wife, and in her arms, a child. Small, quiet, with a birthmark on its shoulder that Adrian recognized the way you recognize your own reflection. That mark didn't lie. Blood never did. And if that child was his, then everything he believed for the last 5 years had been a carefully constructed lie. If this story already has your pulse running, stay with me until the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The charity gala for the Halverson Children's Foundation drew the kind of crowd that made Adrian Vale want to leave the moment he arrived. He stood near the far edge of the ballroom, a glass of whiskey in his right hand, untouched, watching the room with the detached patience of a man who had learned long ago that people at these events were rarely what they presented themselves to be. The chandeliers threw fractured light across 500 guests in tailored suits and evening gowns, and beneath all the perfume and the polished conversation, Adrian could still smell what this really was. An elaborate performance where the wealthy bought absolution for $4,500 a plate. He hadn't wanted to come. Marcus Hale, his head of corporate relations, had spent the better part of 3 weeks making the case that Vale Industries needed a visible philanthropic presence after the merger with Calverton Tech drew scrutiny from 2 federal regulators and a congressional subcommittee that had nothing better to do. Adrian had listened. He'd agreed. He'd showed up in a black suit that cost more than most people made in a month, and now he stood here doing exactly what he'd promised Marcus he would do, being visible, being civil, saying nothing that mattered to anyone who approached him. His right hand, Damon Kress, stood 3 feet behind him and to the left. Damon never stood beside him. Beside suggested equality. 3 feet back meant bodyguard, enforcer, the man who ended conversations that went sideways. Adrian had never needed to explain that arrangement to Damon. They'd worked that way for 11 years. Senator Whitmore is moving your direction, Damon said, low enough that only Adrian could hear. I see him. You want me to intercept? No, let him come. Adrian raised the glass of whiskey to his mouth, not drinking, just giving his face something to do that wasn't a frown. Senator Whitmore was 62, had the handshake of a man who'd been practicing sincerity for 4 decades, and wanted something from Adrian that Adrian hadn't decided whether to give yet. They talked for 6 minutes. Adrian listened more than he spoke, which Whitmore misread as deference. It wasn't. It was assessment. When Whitmore drifted away toward a younger congresswoman with a wider smile, Adrian set his untouched whiskey on a passing tray and exhaled slowly through his nose. That was when he saw her. She was moving through the crowd near the east entrance, wearing a dress the color of deep red wine, her dark hair pulled back in a way that exposed the line of her jaw and the slight tension in her shoulders that Adrian recognized before he recognized her face, because he had spent 3 years learning that tension, knowing what it meant, knowing when she was uncomfortable in a crowd and trying not to show it. Elena. His body processed the information before his mind caught up. His jaw tightened, his weight shifted forward a fraction of an inch. Then his mind arrived, and he locked himself still. 5 years. Elena Cross had been gone for 5 years, and Adrian Vale had spent the first 2 of those years trying to locate her through every resource available to a man with his reach, legal and otherwise, and had come up with nothing. She had vanished with a thoroughness that suggested professional help or an intimate knowledge of exactly how his resources operated. That second possibility had bothered him more than the first. Eventually, after he'd exhausted every avenue and refused to admit he was exhausted, he had made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. He had stopped looking. He had filed for divorce through intermediaries, had the paperwork completed and sealed, and had gone back to the business of being Adrian Vale, which meant making money, accumulating leverage, and telling himself that the cold space in the center of his chest was efficiency, not grief. He watched her now from 40 feet away, moving through the crowd with a baby on her hip. A child. Small. 18 months, maybe 2 years, He wasn't precise enough with these things to know for certain. Dark-haired, dressed in something pale and simple that made the baby look like it had been placed in the wrong setting, the wrong event, the wrong century. Elena had one arm wrapped under the child's bottom and the other pressed lightly to its back, and she was scanning the room with the alert, measured look of someone who had learned to identify exits before they committed to entering a space. Adrian knew that look because he had the same one. He should walk away. He had cataloged the sight, Elena, alive, present, with a child that was almost certainly not his. And the rational course of action was to turn, have Damon confirm her presence for documentation purposes, and continue the evening. Their divorce was final. She was nothing to him legally. Whatever life she had built in the 5 years since she disappeared was not his business, and he had no grounds to make it so. He was already calculating the turn when the woman beside Elena shifted position, leaning in to say something, and Elena's responding laugh moved her head to the right, and the child on her hip turned outward with the restless weight shifting of a toddler who didn't want to be held still. The child's dress slipped. Off the left shoulder, just a few inches, enough to expose a patch of skin at the top of the arm. Dark. A birthmark. Roughly the size and shape of a thumbprint, sitting at the junction of shoulder and upper arm. Adrian Vale did not move. He had a birthmark in exactly that location. So had his father. So had his grandfather, in the photograph Adrian kept in a safe in his office. The only photograph he owned of the man who died before Adrian was old enough to form memories. The mark was genetic, unmistakable, and rare enough that Adrian's childhood physician had once called it a curiosity, the kind of thing that skipped generations but never skipped the bloodline. He stood there for 4 seconds that felt like 4 minutes, looking at that small patch of skin on a child he didn't know, and felt the entire structure of the last 5 years begin to crack at its foundation. He walked toward her. He didn't tell Damon. He heard the subtle shift in Damon's footsteps behind him, surprise registering his movement, and didn't slow down or explain. He moved through the crowd at the measured pace of a man who was used to crowds parting for him, and they did, and he crossed the 40 feet of ballroom in less time than it should have taken, and when Elena looked up from her conversation and her eyes found his face, he watched every shade of color leave her skin. She went still, the way a person goes still when they've been caught doing something they spent years trying not to get caught doing. That stillness told him everything he needed to know and nothing he was prepared to hear. "Elena," he said. Her name came out flat, controlled. He'd practiced a kind of verbal discipline over the years that meant almost nothing. He said revealed anything he actually felt, and the habit was so deeply embedded now that even standing 2 feet from his ex-wife holding a child who might be his, came out sounding like a business greeting. The woman beside Elena, mid-40s, sharp eyes, the careful neutrality of someone trained to be inconspicuous, took a small step back. Protective. Not security trained, but close. Someone who'd spent time learning how to be useful in difficult situations. Elena recovered faster than he'd expected. She always had been good under pressure, which was one of the reasons he'd trusted her in the first place once. "Adrian," her voice was steady, just barely. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I suspect not." The child on her hip had turned at the approach of a stranger and was looking at Adrian with the frank, unguarded assessment that only very young children and very old people could get away with. Dark eyes, dark hair. A face that was still soft and unformed in the way of young children, but with a bone structure underneath that Adrian felt somewhere in his sternum like a tuning fork going off. He kept his eyes on Elena. "We need to talk." "This isn't the place." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Choose somewhere else, or I'll choose for you." The woman beside Elena made a sound that might have been the beginning of an objection. Elena silenced her with the smallest gesture of her free hand, one finger extended downward, barely a movement, the kind of signal that meant don't. She looked at Adrian for a long moment with those dark eyes that he had once believed he understood completely, and he watched her run a calculation behind them. Escape route, risk assessment. Whatever she had been doing for 5 years had sharpened her. She looked older in a way that wasn't age. It was something else, the kind of marking that came from sustained pressure rather than time. All right, she said. They found a private room off the main corridor, a service anteroom with a small table, two chairs, and a door that clicked shut with the particular solidity of a space designed to keep conversations contained. Damon positioned himself outside. The woman who'd been with Elena did the same, after Elena passed the child to her with a brief, low exchange that Adrian couldn't hear. He waited until the door was closed. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He let it go. He stood opposite her with 6 feet of empty floor between them, and he looked at her the way he looked at contracts he suspected of hiding unfavorable terms, steadily, without expression, locating the shape of the problem before he named it. "The child," he said. Elena's jaw shifted. "Her name is Mara." "How old is she?" A beat. One breath. 22 months. The math wasn't complicated. He did it and arrived at a number that put Mara's conception at approximately 2 months before Elena disappeared, and he stood with that number sitting in his chest like a stone while Elena watched him and said nothing else. "The birthmark," he said. He watched her face do something complicated. Not surprise, exactly. More like a person who has been waiting for a specific door to open and feels a particular complicated dread when it finally does. "She has it," Elena said. Quiet. No affect. "On the left shoulder." "Yes." "Like mine." "Yes, Adrian, like yours." He turned away from her just briefly because he needed one moment where he wasn't looking at her face while he processed this. He looked at the wall, white plaster, one framed piece of generic art, a light sconce that threw warm yellow across the corner, and breathed once, deliberately, the way he'd learned to breathe when he needed to stay controlled through something that would otherwise undo him. He turned back. "You were pregnant when you left." Elena's chin came up a fraction. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "No?" "Why?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was the word why deployed as a blunt instrument, the way he deployed it in boardrooms when he wanted an answer that didn't come with justification pre-attached. He'd found that people, when they heard it that way, tended to answer the thing they actually meant to say, rather than the version they'd rehearsed. Elena looked at him for a moment, and he saw something complicated pass behind her eyes. Old pain, old anger, something that might have been guilt, and something else that definitely wasn't. "Because I found out what was happening inside your organization," she said. 2 months before I left. I found out what Harlan was doing." Harlan Voss. Adrian's second in command for 9 years. The man who had run the financial structure of Vale Industries' shadow operations since before Adrian had the reach to hire anyone better. The man who had stood beside Adrian at the funeral for Adrian's father's oldest business partner and put a hand on Adrian's shoulder and said, "We'll get through this together." And Adrian had believed him. Harlan Voss, who had died of a sudden cardiac event 8 months ago in his office at 61, leaving behind a wife, 3 adult children, and a memorial fund that bore his name in 3 cities. "What about Harlan?" Adrian said. Elena looked at him steadily. "He was selling information about you, about your operations, your contacts, your family, to people who would have used it as leverage or as—" She stopped. Her throat moved. "He had already sold Mara, before she was born, before I even knew I was pregnant. He had made an arrangement with a man named Rourke that if you and I had a child, that child could be used." The room was quiet. Adrian could hear the muffled bass of the charity gala's music through 2 walls in a hallway, the particular distant throb of a string quartet playing something classical for people who weren't listening. "Used how?" he said. "As insurance. As a hostage, Adrian. As a way to control you if you ever became inconvenient." He looked at her. "And you believed this?" "I had documentation. I had files." Her voice didn't waver, but her hand moved just slightly, pressing against her hip where a pocket was, a reflex, checking for something that wasn't there. "I didn't come to you with it because Harlan had people watching me, inside the house. I didn't know who else in your organization was involved or how deep it went, and I was 8 weeks pregnant, and I had 48 hours before Harlan's contact made a move, so I ran." "You ran," he repeated. "Yes, instead of coming to me." Her eyes hardened. "I tried to come to you 3 weeks before I left. Do you remember that night in January? Do you remember that I told you I needed to talk to you about something in the organization, something I'd found, and you told me you had a meeting in Zurich and you'd be back in 10 days and we would talk then? He remembered January. He remembered Zurich. He didn't, with any precision, remember that specific conversation, but the shape of it, Elena asking for his time and him filing it away for later, landed in his chest with a particular weight. I came back from Zurich, he said, 9 days later, and by then I'd found the rest of the documentation and I knew that waiting 10 more minutes was something I couldn't afford. She looked at him, and for just a moment the control in her face slipped, and he saw what was under it. Exhaustion, mostly, old and deep, the kind that came from years of sustained vigilance. I had two choices: tell you and not know who was listening, or disappear and keep Mara safe. I chose Mara. Adrian said nothing. He stood with the stone still in his chest and thought about Harlan Voss standing at that funeral with his hand on Adrian's shoulder, and thought about 9 years of trust and daily contact and shared strategy, and tried to locate the place where the math had stopped working. He couldn't find it. That was the problem. He couldn't find a single clear moment when Harlan had looked like what Elena was describing, and that made him more certain that it was true, not less, because the betrayals that destroyed you were never the obvious ones. You have the documentation, he said. Yes. Here. Not on me. I have it in a secure location. I'll need to see it. I know. She paused. Adrian, there's more. He looked at her. Harlan wasn't the only one, she said. He was the top of it, but not all of it. There are people still inside your organization who were part of the arrangement. I don't know all of them. I know 3 names, and one of them was in this building an hour ago, at this event, standing 30 feet from you. The music was still playing through the walls. Someone in the ballroom laughed loudly at something, the sound cutting through even the insulation, bright and inappropriate. Adrian thought about the gala. 500 guests. Senator Whitmore shaking his hand, Marcus Hale circling the room. The board members and associates and philanthropic contacts and faces he'd seen 10,000 times. Which one? He said. Elena shook her head. Not refusal. Caution. Not here. Not tonight. You need to understand what you're dealing with before you move. If you move wrong on this, the people who are still exposed will trigger a contingency that Harlan set up before he died. A dead man's switch. What kind of contingency? She looked at him for a long moment. Mara, she said, the arrangement he made with Rourke didn't die with Harlan. The terms transferred. They're still active. Her voice was steady, but he could see what it cost her. If someone in your current organization feels threatened and triggers the switch, Rourke's people move on Mara within 24 hours. The room felt smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. Adrian was aware of his own breathing in a way that was unusual. He could feel the mechanics of it, the deliberate expansion of his chest, the controlled exhale. He had a daughter. Possibly. Probably. With a birthmark that didn't lie and a timeline that held, and Elena standing across from him with 5 years of secrets that were either the most elaborate and calculated betrayal he'd ever encountered or the truth. He needed to know which. Where are you staying? He said. I'm not going to tell you that tonight. Elena, I will meet with you tomorrow, she said. Neutral location. I'll choose it and I'll contact you. I have a number for your administrative office. That number is filtered through 3 people. Then give me a direct line. He looked at her. She held the look without flinching, and he was reminded uncomfortably of standing across from her in the early years of their marriage when she'd challenged something he'd decided, and he'd been surprised to discover that she was immovable when she thought she was right. He'd admired that once. He'd also found it maddening. He reached into his jacket, produced a card, and placed it on the small table between them, his direct mobile. Almost no one had it. She picked it up without looking at it and put it in her dress somewhere he couldn't identify. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow morning, he corrected. Before 9. She gave a small nod that wasn't exactly agreement. Then she moved toward the door, and he didn't stop her, because he couldn't. Not here, not tonight, not without a confrontation that would end badly in a way he wasn't prepared to manage with incomplete information. She pulled the door open. Elena. She stopped. Didn't turn. If what you're telling me is true, he said, and I'm not yet saying I believe it, then you kept my daughter from me for 22 months. A pause. I know, she said. The door closed behind her. Adrian stood in the small white room with the framed generic art and the sound of distant music and breathed through the thing that was happening in his chest, which was not grief or rage or relief, but something that didn't have a name yet. Some combination of all three pressed together until they became a single compound pressure that sat just under his sternum and didn't let go. He pulled out his phone, opened a text thread, typed 4 words to Damon, "Stay on them, tonight." Then he walked back out into the charity gala where 500 people were eating $4,500 plates and raising money for children who needed help. And he stood at the edge of the ballroom again. And this time when he picked up a glass of whiskey, he drank it. He thought about Harlan. 11 years. The man had sat across from Adrian in this city and a dozen others, had signed documents and made calls and built a structure that Adrian had trusted the way you trusted load-bearing walls, without testing them, because testing them meant admitting they might fail. He thought about Elena. The way she'd looked at Mara when she handed her to the other woman, a specific quality of attention that he recognized as the thing his own mother had never quite managed, that total, unguarded focus that meant, this is the thing I will not let be harmed. He thought about a birthmark on a child's shoulder, and the photograph of his grandfather in the safe in his office, and the gap between what he had believed for 5 years and what was apparently true. And he felt that gap like a physical space, like a room that had always been in his house that he'd never noticed, and now the door was open and he had to decide whether to go in. Damon appeared at his elbow 15 minutes later, moving in from the left with the quiet efficiency that made him good at what he did. She left in a car registered to a property management company I don't recognize, Damon said, low. Driver was professional. I put Kwan on the vehicle. Did she see Kwan? Hard to say. She was watching the street when she got in. Adrian considered this. The woman who was with her. Who is she? No ID yet. She didn't use a name at the event check-in that matches any of our databases. She paid cash for both tickets. Damon paused. They were prepared. Yes. You want to tell me what this is about? Adrian looked at the ballroom. Somewhere across the floor, Marcus Hale was laughing with a cluster of tech executives. Senator Whitmore was moving toward the bar. The string quartet had shifted to something faster, more celebratory, which felt aggressively wrong for the shape of the moment. Not yet, he said. Adrian. He looked at Damon. Damon had worked for him for 11 years, but the same 11 years as Harlan. He had told himself in the service anteroom while Elena was talking that this was a coincidence of timing, not significance. He was still telling himself that. There's a man named Rourke, Adrian said. I want you to find out everything you can about him. Quietly. No channels I don't control directly. Just you. Damon's expression didn't change. He'd had a lot of practice at that too. How urgent? Yesterday, Adrian said. But don't move tonight. Tomorrow morning, early. And Damon, he paused. This conversation doesn't leave us. Damon nodded once and stepped back. Adrian stood at the edge of the ballroom for another 40 minutes, shaking hands and saying nothing that mattered. And the whole time he was in 2 places at once, present enough to perform the role he'd come here to play, and somewhere else entirely, in a service anteroom with a woman he'd spent 5 years trying to stop thinking about, reassembling a version of the last 5 years that looked nothing like the one he'd been living. He drove home alone. The city moved past the windows of the car in amber and white, and he sat in the back with his phone in his hand and didn't look at it, and thought about a small, dark-haired child who had turned to look at him with his grandmother's eyes and a mark on her shoulder that didn't lie. By the time he reached the apartment tower, he had made one decision. He was not going to wait until morning. He stepped out of the car, walked through the lobby, took the elevator to the 32nd floor, and went directly to the office at the back of the apartment where he kept the safe behind the painting of the Manhattan skyline that his interior designer had chosen and he had never liked. He opened it, took out the photograph of his grandfather, tall, dark-suited, standing in front of a building that no longer existed, in a city that was different now, looking directly into the camera with an expression that Adrian had been told all his life looked exactly like his own. He looked at the birthmark on the old man's left shoulder. Then he put the photograph face down on the desk and sat in the dark with the weight of 22 months he hadn't been alive for, and the weight of 11 years of a trusted man's slow betrayal, and the weight of one woman's impossible choice. And he didn't sleep, and he didn't make calls, and he didn't plan anything yet. He just sat. And for the first time in 5 years, the cold space in the center of his chest felt like something other than efficiency. He just didn't know yet whether what he was feeling was the beginning of something or the end. His phone lit up on the desk at 3:14 in the morning, a number he didn't recognize. One message. Rourke already knows you saw me tonight. You have less time than I thought. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, Where is Mara right now? The response came in 11 seconds. Safe. But Adrian, there's someone in your building, has been for 3 hours. He was already standing. He crossed to the window and looked down at the street below. Quiet, minimal traffic at this hour, the usual pattern of light and shadow that he'd stopped noticing years ago. Then he looked at the rooftop of the building across the street. There was a shape there that hadn't been there yesterday. His phone buzzed again. One more message from the unknown number. Check your office. The safe. Not the photograph, him underneath it. He turned from the window and walked back to the desk, and his hands were steady when he moved the photograph aside, but his jaw was locked tight and his pulse was doing something it rarely did, running ahead of him, pushing the pace before he'd made the decision to move. Under the photograph, on the bottom surface of the safe, there was something taped there that he had not put there. A small envelope. His name written on the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. He hadn't opened the safe in 3 weeks. Someone had been inside it. He picked up the envelope and his phone buzzed one final time. And this time when he looked at the screen, the message wasn't from Elena's unknown number. It was from a contact labeled HV Archive, a contact he'd set up 2 years ago to receive any automated communications from Harlan's office systems after his death, forwarded through a legal firm that was supposed to be handling his estate. Harlan Voss, 11 months dead, had just sent him an email. The subject line was 4 words. You should have listened. Adrian opened the envelope with a letter opener from the desk drawer, not because he needed one, but because his hands needed something deliberate to do. Inside, a single index card. Printed, not handwritten. 12 digits that looked like a file reference number, and below it 2 words. Check Meridian. He stood with the card in his hand and thought about Harlan Voss sitting in that office chair on the 44th floor of the Vale Industries building, arranging things so that even his death became another move in a game Adrian hadn't known he was playing. He put the card in his jacket pocket and picked up his phone. Dialed Damon. Damon picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Someone's been in my safe, Adrian said. A beat of silence. When? I don't know, sometime in the last 3 weeks. I need you to pull security footage for the apartment from the past month. Not through building management, directly from the server. I'll need 2 hours. You have one. And Damon, I said no channels I don't control. That means you pull it yourself. No contractors. Understood. Another pause, shorter. The shape on the roof across the street. I clocked it 20 minutes ago. I was going to call you at 6. It's still there. Yes. I have eyes on it. Don't move on it, Adrian said. I want to know who sent it before we spook them. He ended the call and stood at the window again, looking at the shape on the rooftop. A man, he was almost certain, settled into a long exposure position with what looked like a long lens rather than anything more threatening. Surveillance, not a threat. Someone watching to see what Adrian did next. Rourke. Had to be. He knew the name from the margins of a world he'd spent years structuring, so he didn't have to deal with its margins directly. Rourke was what happened when you built an empire and didn't personally manage every layer of it. The kind of operator who moved in the space between legitimate pressure and outright criminal leverage, who dealt in information and access and the exploitation of other people's arrangements. Adrian had crossed orbits with men like Rourke before without ever needing to engage directly. Because Harlan had managed that layer. He sat down in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling for 60 seconds. and let himself feel the full weight of what that meant. 9 years. Every sensitive negotiation, every dangerous alliance, every piece of information about his operations that required delicate handling had gone through Harlan Voss. Adrian had trusted the architecture so thoroughly that he'd stopped inspecting the walls. He picked up the phone and did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He pulled up the number he still had for Elena's mother, a woman named Cora Cross, who lived in a house outside Asheville and who had never particularly liked Adrian and had made no effort to conceal it. The number might be dead. He dialed anyway. It rang 6 times. Then voicemail. A recording in Cora's flat, unhurried voice saying she wasn't available and to leave a message. He didn't leave one. He put the phone down and waited. At 4:40 in the morning, his direct line rang, the number Elena had used earlier. "You're awake," she said. "I don't sleep much." "I know." A pause. Not hesitation, more like someone choosing their position before they spoke. "What did you find in the safe?" A card with a file reference and the word Meridian, and an email from Harlan's archived account. A short silence. He set that up to trigger if someone accessed the safe. I figured, what is Meridian? It's a shell company, part of the structure Harlan used to route payments to Rourke. The file reference on the card leads to a server location. I'll explain when I see you. I wasn't sure that material was still accessible. Was that your envelope in my safe? A long pause, longer than the others. Yes, she said. You've been in my apartment. 3 weeks ago. I came back to the city to assess whether it was safe to approach you. I needed to leave something in place in case... She stopped. Steady breath. In case approaching you directly wasn't possible. In case something happened to me first. The clarity of that, the preparation behind it, the cold practicality of a woman who had spent 22 months managing risk around her own survival, landed in him with a force that wasn't anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. You broke into my apartment, he said. Your security code hasn't changed in 5 years. Neither has your safe combination. Her voice was level. You always used your father's death date backward. He said nothing. She was right on both counts, and the fact that she was right, that he had changed nothing in his personal security infrastructure while the world he thought he controlled was apparently full of open doors, was a specific kind of humiliating that he wasn't ready to examine yet. The man on my roof, he said. Rourke's. He wants to know if you're moving. She paused. Don't move tonight. Don't call anyone in your organization. If there's someone inside who's connected to Rourke, any unusual activity from you will trigger an alert. You said one of Rourke's contacts was at the event tonight, inside my organization. Yes. Give me the name. Tomorrow. In person. Elena? In person, Adrian. Her voice didn't harden exactly. It just stopped moving. I've spent 22 months keeping Mara safe by being careful. I'm not going to stop being careful because you're impatient. He exhaled through his nose. Where is she right now? Mara. A moment. She's sleeping. She does this thing when she sleeps where she puts her hands up beside her head, like she's surrendering. A pause in which something flickered behind the words that Elena didn't elaborate on. She's fine. She's with Petra, the woman from tonight. Who is Petra? Someone I trust completely. That's all you need to know right now. That's not... I know it's not enough for you. I know that you want full information and complete control and a structured plan before you move on anything. I know how you operate, but this is not your operation, Adrian. Not yet. So I need you to let me manage this for 12 more hours. He sat with that for a moment. 12 hours. It was the kind of ask that would have been easy to refuse if he wasn't already looking at the shape of his own blind spot spread out in front of him like a map. 7 a.m., he said. I'll come to you. I'll come to you. The lobby of the Callaway building on 5th. Public enough. I'll be there at 7:30. She ended the call before he could adjust the terms. He put the phone down and looked at the photograph of his grandfather, still face down on the desk where he'd left it. He didn't turn it over. He spent the rest of the night in the desk chair, reading through everything in Vale Industries' internal documentation that referenced Harlan Voss and the operational divisions Harlan had managed, looking for the shape of it, the pattern of what had been hidden, and where the gaps were. He had access to everything. He was the architect. And as he read, with the discipline of a man who had built his competence on pattern recognition, he started to find the gaps. They were elegant. That was the worst part. Harlan had been genuinely good at this. The financial roots were layered, the shell company references buried in legitimate transaction language. The timing of key communications arranged so that Adrian's attention would always have been on something else when the significant moves happened. It wasn't the work of a man who'd gone corrupt under pressure. It was the work of a man who'd been building this since the beginning. At 6:15, Damon appeared in the apartment doorway. He had the security server files on a tablet, and he had the particular expression of a man who had found something he didn't want to have found. He set the tablet on the desk without comment and stepped back. Adrian looked at the footage timestamp. 3 weeks ago, 2:18 a.m., a woman, Elena, in dark clothes, hair pulled back, moving through his private elevator corridor with the keypad entry that shouldn't have been possible unless she had the code, which she did. Moving to the office, opening the safe, placing the envelope. Gone in 6 minutes. He looked at the footage for another moment. Then he looked at Damon. "She was here," Damon said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man accounting for something that should have been caught and wasn't. "Yes. Our overnight security missed it." "Yes." Adrian closed the footage. "I want a full audit of who has been accessing this building in the past 6 months. Not through security management. You personally." Damon nodded and didn't ask the other question that was sitting clearly in his expression. He was good at not asking. "Damon," Adrian paused. "When Harlan died, were you at his office that day?" The question landed in the air between them with a specific gravity. Damon met his eyes. "No, I was in Phoenix with you. We were both in Phoenix." "Who was here?" "Marcus, the legal team, the usual." Marcus Hale, corporate relations, the man who had spent 3 weeks persuading Adrian to attend the Halverson Gala. Adrian filed this away without expression and told Damon to go get some sleep before the day started. When Damon left, Adrian sat alone with the files and the filing and the shape of something that kept getting larger the more he looked at it, and he understood, with the cold, specific clarity that he usually reserved for hostile takeovers, that the problem inside his organization was not small. He was at the Callaway building at 7:20. He had beaten her there, and he was aware that she would notice this, and he was aware that he didn't care. She arrived at 7:32. Different clothes, dark jeans, a gray jacket, hair down now. She moved through the lobby without looking around first, which either meant she was confident in her exit routes or she was too tired to be cautious, and he suspected it was the former because Elena Cross was, in his experience, rarely anything but deliberate. She sat across from him at a small table near the east window. Set a coffee cup down. Didn't offer him one, which meant she hadn't known he'd arrived first and hadn't bought two. He didn't comment on it. "Mars, he said first, still safe. Petra has her at a location I'm not going to name here. I need to see her." Elena looked at him, not unkindly, but without any softening. "I know. We'll get there." "Elena, the name you asked for." She kept her voice below the ambient noise of the lobby, which was starting to fill with morning foot traffic. "The person in your organization who was at the gala last night and is connected to Rourke's arrangement with Harlan." She paused. "Marcus Hale." He had already arrived at Marcus. He had arrived at him at approximately 5 a.m. while reading through the files. Hearing it confirmed was a different thing from having suspected it. It settled into him differently, heavier, more final. "How long?" he said. "From the beginning, as far as I can tell." Marcus was the one who brought Harlan into the arrangement with Rourke. Harlan didn't recruit Marcus. Marcus recruited Harlan. She watched his face. "I know that's the opposite of what you'd expect. Marcus has been with me for 7 years. "Yes." "He doesn't have the operational knowledge that Harlan had. He doesn't need it. His role was access and positioning. He controls your public schedule, your appearance calendar, your philanthropic commitments. He knew about the gala 3 months ago. He made sure you'd be there. She let that sit for a moment. He positioned you to see me, Adrian. He knew I was going to be there. I don't know how, but he knew. And he made sure you were in that room. Adrian went still. He wanted you to find out about Mara, he said slowly. Not for your benefit. Her voice was flat. If you find out about Mara and you move on Rourke without understanding the full structure, Rourke triggers the contingency and Mara disappears. Marcus benefits from that because it destroys you, personally and professionally. A man like you, with a child taken, it would consume you. You'd make mistakes. You'd become manageable. The word manageable landed in his chest like something with edges. He looked out the window at Fifth Avenue, filling with morning people, commuters, dog walkers, a man eating a bagel while talking into a phone. The ordinary traffic of a city that didn't know it was being used as the backdrop for something that felt from the inside like the controlled demolition of his entire life. You said there were 3 names, he said. Marcus is one. Yes. The other 2. One is a man named Garrison Cole. He works for Rourke directly. He's not inside your organization, but he has been managing the surveillance on you for the past 8 months. He was the contact Harlan used to pass financial information. She took a sip of her coffee. Put it down. The third one is more complicated. He waited. Your legal counsel, she said. Sandra Oye. He looked at her. Sandra Oye had been his primary legal counsel for 4 years. She had an office on the 38th floor and a reputation that extended well beyond his organization, and she had been the attorney who had processed his divorce filing. She had been the one who handled all the documentation around his separation from Elena. She didn't file my divorce through normal channels, he said, very quietly. No, she filed a version of it. The version that would be found if anyone looked. But there are 2 other sets of documents that she prepared at Harlan's direction. Contingency arrangements that would give Rourke's organization a legal claim to contest custody of any child born of your marriage, based on contract language that was buried in the original prenuptial agreement. Elena's jaw was set. Language I didn't know was there when I signed it. Language that Sandra put there. The prenuptial agreement that Sandra had drafted, that Elena had signed 5 years ago, that Adrian had reviewed and approved without, he now understood, reading with the granular attention he gave to the contracts that felt important. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. If Rourke triggers the contingency, he said, Sandra activates the legal framework, which gives Rourke's organization a documented basis to claim guardianship of Mara as a contractual asset. It would take years to untangle in court, years during which Mara would be... She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was designed to be bulletproof, Adrian. They spent 9 years building it. 9 years. Before Mara existed. Before the marriage, almost, depending on when exactly Harlan had started working with Marcus and Rourke. They had built a cage around a child who hadn't been born yet, and they had done it using Adrian's own infrastructure, his own lawyers, his own trust. He stood up from the table. He needed to move. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the lobby and breathed through the rage that was moving up through his chest with the slow, pressurized force of something that had been compressed for too long in too small a space. Elena didn't say anything. She gave him the moment, which was more disciplined than most people would have managed. He turned back. The documentation you have, he said. Where? A secure server. Petra has the access credentials. If something happens to me, she passes them to a specific attorney I have in Portland who will take it public. She met his eyes. I set it up that way deliberately. If Rourke's people think taking me out of the picture solves their problem, they're wrong. You set up a dead man's switch of your own. I learned from the best. She didn't say it with venom, just fact. He came back to the table and sat, looked at her directly. I need the server access now. Not as insurance against something happening to you, because I need to move on this and I need the documentation to do it correctly. If you move wrong, I won't move wrong. You can't guarantee that. No, but Elena, he said her name differently this time, without the flat deployment he'd been using since last night. It came out with something underneath it, some friction that suggested how much effort the control was costing him. I have been sitting in my office for 6 hours reading Harlan's financial architecture, and I understand what I'm looking at. I know how to dismantle this, but I cannot do it blind. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a couple walked past their table and a child dropped something ceramic in the cafe counter across the lobby, and the sound of it breaking echoed briefly through the space. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. "Harlan's email. The one you got last night." She put both hands around her coffee cup. "He set up multiple triggers. The one that sent you the email was the safe access. But there's another trigger. One that activates if you pull his archived financial records directly, which I'm assuming you've done in the last 6 hours."
Much.
He had, at approximately 3 a.m. "What does it activate?" he said. "It sends a notification to Marcus." She watched his face. "He knows you've been in the records. He's known since approximately—" She checked her watch. 3:15 this morning? Adrian thought about Marcus Hale, the 7 years of early morning briefings and late-night calls, and the careful, professionally warm relationship that Marcus had cultivated with the same patience that now looked, in retrospect, like the patience of someone constructing a very long game. He thought about the phone that Marcus was carrying right now, with a notification on it that said Adrian was in the records. "He'll move," Adrian said. "He's probably already moved. He'll contact Rourke. Rourke will assess whether to trigger the contingency now or wait." She exhaled slowly. "We have a narrow window before this goes from manageable to reactive." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Marcus Hale. "Heard you were in early today. Checking in. Are we still on for the 9 a.m. briefing?" Normal. Professionally casual. The text of a man who was either unconcerned or performing unconcerned so well it was indistinguishable from the real thing. He turned the phone so Elena could see the screen. She read it, and something in her face shifted. A small tightening around the eyes that wasn't fear exactly, but was close. "If you don't respond normally, he'll know you know," she said. Adrian typed, 9 a.m. works. See you then. He put the phone face down on the table and looked at Elena and said, "I have 90 minutes. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a small flash drive, and placed it on the table between them. "That's a copy of the core documentation," she said. "Enough to understand the structure. The full server access I'll give you tonight, after 9 a.m. passes and I know you didn't walk into that meeting and do something irreversible." He picked up the drive, looked at it, put it in his pocket. "I want to see Mara," he said. Elena looked at him, and he watched her run the calculation, the same risk assessment she'd been running since last night, the same careful measuring of what was safe against what was necessary. He watched the moment when the calculation shifted. "Tonight," she said, "after 9 a.m., if you hold the line through that meeting and don't tip Marcus off, tonight you can see her." He nodded. He stood to go. She stood as well, and they were briefly at the same height in the morning light from the east window, and he was close enough to see the shadows under her eyes, and the fine tension in her jaw that he recognized as the specific exhaustion of someone who hadn't truly relaxed in a very long time. "Elena," he said it quietly, "whatever happens from here, whatever I find in those files, whatever this costs, I need you to know that I'm going to fix this, all of it." She looked at him. Something moved across her face, complicated, old, not quite closed. "I know you believe that," she said. She walked out through the lobby, and he watched her go and did not let himself think about the gap between "I know you believe that" and "I believe you." He had 87 minutes until the 9 a.m. briefing. He took a car back to the Vale Industries building, went directly to his office, and inserted the flash drive into an air-gapped laptop that he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk for exactly the kind of situation that he had never actually expected to encounter. The files loaded. He started reading. 20 minutes in, he found the original contract between Harlan Voss and a holding entity registered in Liechtenstein that traced, through 4 layers of corporate structure, back to a name he recognized. Not Rourke. Older than Rourke. Someone Adrian had known for longer. He sat back in his chair and looked at the name on the screen, and felt the ground shift under everything he thought he understood about how the last decade of his life had been arranged, and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the betrayal went so much deeper than Harlan, deeper than Marcus, deeper than any of the architecture he'd been examining since 3 a.m., and that the person whose name was on that founding contract had been sitting at the center of Adrian's world since before Vale Industries was worth destroying. His desk phone rang. His assistant's line. He picked up. "Mr. Vale? Marcus Hale is here. He says he knows you're in, and he'd like to come up now rather than waiting for 9. Adrian looked at the name on the screen, looked at the clock, looked at the door. "Send him up," he said. The elevator opened on the ground floor, and Elena was already there, standing 6 feet from the doors with her phone in her hand and her face doing something that Adrian had never seen it do before. Not panic, because Elena didn't panic, but the thing that lived just beneath panic in a person who had been managing fear for so long that it had become structural, load-bearing, and was now threatening to give way all at once. He crossed to her in 4 steps. "Petra's phone," he said, "goes to voicemail 3 times. She doesn't do that. She doesn't turn her phone off. She doesn't let it ring out. We have a protocol." She stopped herself. Reset. "We have a check-in protocol, and she missed the 8:45 window." "How long has she had Mara in that location?" "Since 2 a.m. They moved after the gala. So whoever took them found the location in 6 hours. Elena's jaw tightened. Someone followed Petra from the gala, or... She stopped again. "Or someone already knew where she'd go," Adrian finished. "Someone who knew your protocols." She looked at him, and he could see her running it, and he could see the moment she arrived at the same place he'd arrived at, because her face changed in a way that was very small and very final. "My mother," she said. She knew Petra. Petra worked for a legal firm in Asheville 4 years ago, before I brought her here. Her voice was flat now, the stripped-down voice from the phone call. "My mother introduced us." Adrian didn't say anything. He took her arm up, not roughly, just the grip of a man establishing direction, and moved her toward the building's service exit, where Damon was already waiting with a car that had been running for 90 seconds. They were in the back seat and moving before the door closed fully. 43rd and Lex, Adrian said to the driver. "Fast." He turned to Damon in the front passenger seat. "Rourke is on 38 with Sandra. I need someone in that building watching that floor. Nobody moves on them yet. I want eyes only until I tell you otherwise." "I have Reyes on it," Damon said. He was already on his phone with the other hand, low-voiced, running 2 conversations simultaneously with the efficiency of a man who had spent 11 years doing exactly this. Adrian looked at Elena beside him. She was looking at her phone, still calling Petra. The line rang and went to voicemail, and she ended the call and called again. And Adrian watched her do this 3 times and didn't tell her to stop, because the alternative, sitting with her hands in her lap and not trying, was not something he was willing to ask of her. The car moved fast through midtown traffic. 8:59 in the morning. The city at full operational tempo, cabs and delivery trucks and pedestrian crossings, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday that didn't know what was moving through it. "If Rourke has her," Elena said, without looking up from her phone, "he'll use her as the trigger mechanism. He won't hurt her until he has to. She's only valuable whole." Her voice said these words with a clinical precision that cost her something visible. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself from the inside out. "He'll contact me, or contact you. He needs a response from one of us before he can leverage the legal structure Sandra activated." "Sandra hasn't activated anything yet," Adrian said. "How do you know?" "Because if she had, I would have received an automatic notification from the court system. My legal monitoring software flags any filings connected to Vale Industries within minutes." He checked his phone. Nothing from the monitoring system. "She's waiting for confirmation from Rourke that he has Mara before she files. She needs the leverage in place before she goes on record." "So we have a window. A small one." "How small?" "However long it takes Rourke to send us proof of life and make his demand." He looked at her. "Which means we need to be at that apartment before he decides we're not going to respond fast enough and changes his approach." The car turned onto 43rd and the building was mid-block, A 7-story pre-war with a narrow lobby visible through glass doors. Adrian was out of the car before it fully stopped, and Elena was 2 steps behind him, and Damon was out of the front seat with his hand near his jacket in the particular way that meant he was ready without advertising it. The lobby was unstaffed at this hour, a key fob building with a directory panel. Adrian looked at Elena. "3rd floor," she said. 3C. She had a key. She'd had it in her jacket, which meant she'd grabbed it when she left the lower office, which meant some part of her had been running this scenario since Petra stopped answering. He noticed this without comment, and they took the stairs because elevators announced arrival. The stairwell smelled of old building, concrete dust, and the particular closeness of a space that saw maintenance and not much else. Their footsteps were quiet. Elena's breathing was controlled but not relaxed, the rhythm of someone applying effort to stay measured. 2nd floor landing, 3rd floor door. She put her hand on the door handle and stopped, looked at Adrian. He was already past her, his shoulder taking the door gently, holding it just cracked to listen. The corridor was quiet. 3 apartments off the central hallway. 3C at the far end. A narrow rectangle of morning light from a window at the corridor's end, and in that light, nothing moving. No sound from 3C, no sound from anywhere. Too quiet. He looked at Damon, who was 1 step behind him, and made a small gesture. Damon understood and moved to the right side of the hallway wall, and Adrian moved left, and Elena, he put a hand on her shoulder and held her back with a pressure that said, "Stay," and hoped she would, just this once, let him go first. She stayed. They reached the door of 3C in the quiet of a building where everyone had already left for work or was still asleep. Adrian looked at the door frame. The lock was intact. No visible damage. He looked down. The threshold. Something dark, barely visible, at the gap under the door. Not blood. Too matte. He crouched and looked at the angle. A scarf. The end of a fabric scarf, pale blue, caught under the door from the inside as if someone had dropped it or been dragged past it. He looked at Elena and pointed at the scarf. He watched her eyes go to it and watched her recognize it, and watched her face do the thing where everything tightened at once. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open fast and low and stepped into the apartment. It was a small space. Living room immediately inside, kitchen to the right, 1-bedroom door open to the left, furnished for short stays, sparse and neutral. A child's toy on the floor, a soft animal of some kind, on its side near the couch. The couch cushions displaced. A coffee mug on the floor, broken, coffee spread across the hardwood in a shape that meant it had fallen rather than been thrown. Petra was on the kitchen floor. Elena made a sound behind him that he'd never heard from her, something that didn't have a category, and was moving toward Petra before Adrian could position himself, and he let her go because Petra's chest was moving. He could see it from the doorway, the shallow but present rise and fall, and the immediate priority was not the kitchen. He went to the bedroom. Empty. The crib that had been set up in the corner, a portable travel crib, the collapsible kind, a fitted sheet with a pattern of small animals on it, was empty. The sheet was still warm when he pressed his hand to it. She had been here 20 minutes ago, maybe 30. The warmth of the sheet said 30 at the outside. He stood in that small bedroom with the empty crib and the warm sheet and felt something move through him that was not like anything he had a name for. Not grief, not rage, not the cold calculation he'd been running since last night. Something that was all 3 compressed into a single physical sensation in the center of his chest. Very still, very dense, like a stone that had always been there but had just become too heavy to carry without noticing the weight. He walked back to the kitchen. Petra was conscious. Barely. Elena had her upright against the cabinet, was checking her head, a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled significantly and then stopped. Petra's eyes were tracking, unfocused but present. Petra. Adrian crouched. How many people? Petra's eyes moved to him. She swallowed. 2, she said. The word came out thick. 1 at the door. 1. She stopped. Grimaced. 1 was already in the apartment. Before we got here, they were already inside. The building's key fob lock. Someone had access, or someone had been given access. Mara, Elena said. Not a question, A sound. She was... Petra's face tightened. She was asleep. They took her in the carrier. She wasn't... She looked at Elena. She was still asleep when they took her. She didn't cry. Elena pressed her forehead down against the top of Petra's head for exactly 1 second. Then she stood up. She turned to Adrian. Her eyes were dry. Whatever was happening inside her had been sealed over with something that was not composure. Exactly. It was harder than composure, more deliberate, the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was running the decision rather than the feeling. Rourke needs to reach us before he can move Sandra, she said. He hasn't reached us yet, so he has Mara in a holding location, close, somewhere he can produce her on short notice. Her voice was the stripped clinical voice. Red Hook, the logistics warehouse. That's the obvious location. Yes, which is why he'll have a contingency if we arrive. She looked at him. But he doesn't know that you know about Red Hook. He doesn't know the full scope of what I've given you. He thinks he's still dealing with a man who's 2 moves behind. Adrian looked at her. You want me to let him think that? I want you to call him. Make the call he's waiting for. Tell him you found the empty apartment, that you're scared, that you want to negotiate. She paused. Make him feel like he's won. He looked at her for a moment. The specific thing she was asking, the performance of a man undone, frightened, manageable, went against every instinct 11 years of building himself into something unmanageable had installed. And while he's on the call with me, he said, Damon goes in. He looked at Damon. Damon said very quietly, I need 8 minutes and a floor plan. I can give you both, Elena said. She pulled out her phone and opened an application. Building schematics, he realized, the kind you could pull from public records if you knew what you were looking for and had spent 8 months preparing. The warehouse has a loading dock on the south side, access door here. Rourke keeps his operational holding space on the 2nd floor, north corner. I've had eyes on the building long enough to know his pattern. He takes people there when he wants them controlled but accessible. She turned the phone so Damon could see the schematic. Damon studied it for 15 seconds. His face was very still. 3 men minimum inside, he said. Possibly 5. Probably 5, Elena said. And Mara. And Mara. Damon looked at Adrian. The look between them said several things that neither man put into words. Then Damon nodded once. 8 minutes, he said. Adrian's phone rang. Unknown number. Different from the 2 o'clock text. Different from Elena's unknown line. A new number. He looked at it. Looked at Elena. She gave a single small nod. He answered. Mr. Vale. The voice on the other end was even, moderate, the voice of a man who conducted business in uncomfortable circumstances so regularly that the discomfort had become the baseline. Not cold, just uninflected. Professional. In the way that the word professional described a function rather than a quality. I think you know why I'm calling. Rourke, Adrian said. Good. That saves time. A brief pause. Your daughter is safe, and will remain that way provided you're reasonable in the next few minutes. Adrian turned away from Elena and moved to the apartment's single window. He needed to keep his face away from her while he did this, because what he was about to perform required a quality he didn't want her to see him manufacture. What do you want? He said. He let his voice drop slightly, let a fraction of the control slip in a specific, targeted way. Not much, just enough. A man trying to hold it together. A man who is afraid and showing just enough of it to seem real. 2 things. First, you withdraw from the Calverton merger. The regulatory attention it's bringing creates exposure for people who have been patient partners of yours for a long time. Second, you sign over administrative control of the Vale Industries shadow operations to a structure my organization will provide. Harlan had this set up. Sandra has the documentation. It's a clean transition. And my daughter is returned to her mother within the hour after you sign, unharmed, unhappy about the car ride, but fine. A pause. This isn't personal, Mr. Vale. You've been a significant asset for a long time. We'd like to continue that relationship on a basis that's more transparent. Adrian said nothing for 2 seconds. The right 2 seconds. The silence of a man calculating surrender. "I need to speak with my attorney before I sign anything," he said. "Of course, Sandra is available. I'd suggest you call her directly." "Give me 30 minutes. 20, Rourke said. "Call Sandra, get the documents. We can conclude this before lunch." The line went dead. Adrian put the phone down. He turned to Damon. "Go." Damon was already at the apartment door. He had made 3 quiet calls in the last 4 minutes, and he had the schematic on his phone, and he left without another word, moving at the pace of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what the pace needed to be. Adrian looked at Elena. "I'm going to call Sandra." "What?" "She thinks I'm complying. I'm going to let her think that for 18 minutes. He was already dialing. "While she's managing me, she's not managing anything else." Sandra picked up on the first ring. She was ready for him. Her voice had the careful, measured warmth of a lawyer who was managing a client in distress. And it was very good. She was very good. And Adrian listened to her tell him that she had the documentation ready and that this was the cleanest resolution available and that Mara would be home by noon. And he said, "I understand," and walked me through the documents, and I need to read the language, and he stretched every exchange out by 10 seconds more than necessary, asking her to repeat clauses, asking for clarification on terms that didn't need clarification, performing the methodical slowness of a man who was afraid to rush, because rushing meant accepting something he couldn't take back. 12 minutes. 13. Damon was in the building. Elena was standing at the apartment window with her arms crossed and her eyes on the street below and her phone in her hand waiting for Damon's signal, and Adrian watched her from across the room while he kept Sandra on the line, and he thought about what Elena had done. 8 months of surveillance on a Red Hook warehouse, a flash drive in his safe, a phone call to her mother that cost her more than any tactical maneuver he could name. And he thought about the woman he'd believed he knew for 3 years, and the woman she'd actually been, and the gap between those two things was not what he'd expected it to be. He'd expected the gap to be a lie. Instead, it was a weight she'd been carrying alone. Elena's phone lit up. She looked at it and her entire body changed. The rigid stillness broke. Something released in her shoulders, and she turned to Adrian with an expression that was not yet relief. Not yet, because they were not there yet, but was the first genuine, unguarded thing he'd seen from her in 20 years of knowing her face. He ended the call with Sandra mid-sentence and crossed to Elena in 3 steps. "Damon," he said. "She's out," Elena said. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, the first crack in 22 hours of maintained control. "He has her. Damon says she's fine. She's fine. She was still in the carrier. She slept through the whole thing. She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered it. "She's fine." He exhaled, once, long. Then he picked up his phone and called the direct line of the only federal contact he had who was entirely outside his compromised organizational channels, a woman named Hargrove at the Financial Crimes Division, whom he had cultivated as a resource 2 years ago and never used, precisely for a moment when he needed a line that nobody inside Vail Industries could have reached. "I have documentation of a coordinated financial fraud and extortion scheme involving 3 principals in my organization, a connected shadow entity, and a material witness in protective custody," he said when she answered. "I can have everything on your desk in 2 hours. I need simultaneous action on 4 individuals before close of business today, or the documentation chain is at risk." He paused. "Yes, I'm certain. Yes, I'm ready to cooperate fully. 2 hours. He ended the call. Then he called Damon. "Bring her to the Vail building. Use the private garage. Nobody else in that elevator." "Copy." He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the small apartment kitchen where Petra was sitting up against the cabinet with a dish towel pressed to her forehead, and Elena was beside him with her arms still crossed, the controlled exterior rebuilding itself piece by piece after the crack that had shown through for those few seconds, and he looked at her and said very quietly the only true thing he was certain of at this moment. "She's going to be all right." Elena looked at him with that old, complicated gaze, the one that had multiple layers and none of them simple, the one he'd spent 3 years learning to read and then 5 years trying to forget. "I know," she said. They were back in the Vale building at 23 minutes past 9. Rourke would be recalculating now. No signed documents from Sandra, no compliance call from Adrian, and the silence from the Red Hook warehouse that he'd be reading as a problem. Adrian had a 17-minute window before Rourke understood that the game had changed, and he had used 11 of those minutes getting here, and the remaining 6 he needed to be in position for what came next. Because Rourke was still in contact with Marcus. Marcus was somewhere in the city, moving. Sandra was in the building on the 38th floor with a set of documents that needed to be in federal hands before she destroyed them, and Cora Cross was in Asheville on a phone line that had been recorded for 40 minutes this morning, saying things that a federal prosecutor was going to read with the particular attention of someone who had spent a career looking for exactly this kind of foundational admission. The elevator opened on the ground floor. Damon was there, and in his arms, unhappy about being held by a stranger, squirming with the focused displeasure of a toddler who had been transported in a carrier for too long and wanted to be put down, was a small dark-haired girl with his grandmother's eyes and a birthmark on her left shoulder. Mara looked at Adrian with the same frank, unguarded assessment she'd given him last night across 40 feet of ballroom floor. He looked back at her, and something in his chest that had been locked for 5 years, and before that had never quite been fully open, shifted in a way that was not subtle and was not manageable and did not require him to name it. Elena was at Damon's side in 2 steps. She took Mara from him and held her against her chest and pressed her mouth to the top of her daughter's head, and Mara made a sound of protest that softened into something else. A small fist closing in Elena's hair, the body-level recognition of a child finding the thing it most needed. Adrian stood 3 feet away and watched this. Then his phone rang. The screen said, "Rourke." He answered. "Mr. Vale?" The professional voice, but with something different in it now, a slight calibration. A man who had found a discrepancy in his numbers and was very carefully not showing that it alarmed him. "It seems we're behind schedule." "Yes," Adrian said. "We are." "Is there a problem with the documentation?" "Several," Adrian said. "But they're being resolved." He paused. "By people who aren't you." A silence. The kind of silence that happens when a man understands, for the first time, that he has been running a play against someone who has been running a different and larger play simultaneously. "Mr. Vale! Rourke!" Adrian's voice had dropped the performance, all of it. What was left underneath was something that didn't need volume or inflection to communicate its weight. "My daughter is safe. Sandra Oye is about to have a conversation with federal agents that she has not prepared for. The documentation from Harlan's archive is in the hands of people who know exactly how to use it, and the recording of your co-architect describing the arrangement in her own words has been submitted in the last 40 minutes to a contact who is not inside my organizational chain." He paused. "You have a decision to make in the next few minutes about whether you'd like to be cooperative or not. I'd suggest cooperative, but I understand if you need a moment." The line was quiet. Then, "Who do I call?" Adrian gave him Hargrove's number. He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and turned back to Elena, who was watching him over the top of Mara's head with an expression that was still complicated, still layered, still not simple, but had something in it that hadn't been there last night, or this morning, or any of the hours in between. Not trust exactly. Not yet. But the space where trust could begin, if what came next was handled the way it needed to be handled. Mara turned in Elena's arms and looked at Adrian again. She reached out one hand, small, deliberate, the experimental reach of a child testing the permanence of a thing, and her fingers found his sleeve and closed around the fabric and held on with the particular conviction of someone who had decided, without ceremony or explanation, that this was acceptable. He didn't move. He stood there with his daughter's hand in his sleeve, and the weight of everything that had led to this moment distributed across his chest and shoulders, and he understood that the version of himself that had walked into a charity gala last night was already gone, that the man standing here was going to have to be built from different materials, and that the building was going to take longer than the dismantling, and that he did not yet know if Elena was going to be willing to stand near enough to watch it happen. But the first thing was Mara. The first thing was always going to be Mara now. His phone buzzed. Damon. Marcus located, Midtown Hotel. Hargrove's team is moving. And from Reyes on 38, Sandra has company. Federal. She's not running. The structure that had been built against him over 11 years was coming down in a single morning, and Adrian Vale stood in the lobby of his own building with his daughter's fist in his sleeve and felt, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, that the thing collapsing was not him. He looked at Elena. She was watching him the way she'd watched him from across that ballroom last night, with recognition, with wariness, with something else underneath both of those things that she hadn't named yet, and he wasn't going to name for her. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed, but the worst of it is. She looked at him for a long moment. Then Mara made a sound, small, imperious, the sound of a child who had been patient long enough and now required resolution. And Elena looked down at her daughter, and something shifted in her face that was the closest thing to peace he had seen from her in 24 hours. And she said, to Mara and not to Adrian, in a voice that was finally and completely unguarded, I know, baby, I know. The federal case moved faster than Adrian had expected, and slower than he could tolerate. Hargrove's team executed simultaneous actions on Sandra Oy and Marcus Hale before noon on the same Tuesday that had started with a charity gala hangover and ended with a toddler's fist in his sleeve. Marcus was taken from a room on the 14th floor of a Midtown hotel where he had apparently been waiting for a call from Rourke that was never going to come. Sandra was walked out of the Vale Industries building through the lobby, not the service exit, not the private elevator, the main lobby, at 11:47 in the morning, and Adrian stood at the window of his office and watched it happen and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. Rourke cooperated. The cooperation was self-interested and comprehensive, and arrived with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent a career understanding exactly when a position was no longer defensible and moving to the next available position without sentiment. He gave Hargrove's team 3 years of operational records, contact logs, and financial routing documentation in exchange for a negotiated arrangement that Adrian had no power to block and did not try to. Rourke's cooperation was going to be more useful to the federal case than Rourke's prosecution, and Adrian understood this even while the part of him that was not thinking strategically wanted something different. The Liechtenstein Holding Company was dissolved within 72 hours through a legal mechanism that Sandra's own documentation had inadvertently made possible, a clause in the founding structure that allowed unilateral dissolution by any signatory under certain fraud-related conditions. Werner Falk, the Liechtenstein national, exercised that clause with the speed of a man who had been waiting for a reason to exit an arrangement that had become inconvenient. That left Cora Cross. The recording Elena had made ran 42 minutes. It was clear, direct, and contained 3 specific admissions that Hargrove described as unusually valuable. Cora Cross was arrested at her house in Asheville on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the gala. Elena learned about it from a news alert on her phone. She was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the temporary apartment Adrian had arranged for her and Mara, and she read the alert, and she put the phone face down on the table, and she sat with her coffee for a long time without drinking it. Adrian knew about this because Damon had told him, and Damon had told him because Adrian had asked Damon to make sure Elena had security coverage she couldn't see and wouldn't object to. And Damon had done this with the professionalism of someone who understood that the request was not about surveillance, it was about a man who didn't yet have the standing to be present himself and was doing the only thing available to him. He had not pushed for contact in those 8 days. This had cost him more than any of the legal maneuvering or the federal cooperation or the dismantling of the organizational structure that Harlan had built over 9 years. The professional work had a familiar shape. It was large and complex and required sustained attention, and he was good at it, and being good at it gave him somewhere to put the energy that would otherwise have had nowhere to go. The restraint around Elena had no such structure. It was just restraint, undecorated, with nothing on the other side of it that he could see clearly. He had sent one message on the second day, a number Mara's pediatrician would need, a specific specialist he'd identified through his own research as the best in the city for developmental checkups in the toddler range. He hadn't attached anything personal to it, just the name and number and a single line, in case it's useful. Elena had responded 4 hours later with 2 words, "Thank you." He had read those two words more times than was reasonable for a man who was simultaneously managing a federal cooperation process and the restructuring of a company whose internal trust architecture had been comprehensively compromised. On the 9th day, she called him. "I want to talk," she said. "In person. Not about the case." He said, "Tell me when and where." She chose a park, not the kind of park that suggested anything. Not romantic, not symbolic, just a park with benches and a small fountain and a path where you could walk if the conversation required movement and sit if it required stillness. She was there when he arrived, which meant she'd arrived early, which he read as intention rather than anxiety. Mara was in a stroller beside her, awake, working at something small in plastic, with the focused indifference of a child who had already cataloged the environment and found it acceptable. Adrian sat beside Elena on the bench. Not close. A few feet of bench between them, enough to establish that this was a conversation rather than anything else, and to give them both the option of distance if the conversation required it. "My mother's attorney called me," Elena said. She was looking at the fountain, not at him. "She wants me to provide a character statement for the sentencing." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She paused. "I'm not going to do it. But I needed to say I'd think about it because if I said no immediately, I would have said other things along with the no, and those things wouldn't have helped anyone." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Same gesture as the Callaway building, hands around the cup, not for warmth, just for something deliberate to hold. "She called me baby on that recording. Before she told me the arrangement had been running for 11 years, she called me baby." He said nothing. "I keep thinking about that," Elena said. "Not the 11 years. The word." He looked at the side of her face, the line of her jaw, the particular tension that had been there every time he'd seen her in the last 9 days, and that was still there now but differently, looser, perhaps, or differently placed. The tension of someone living with a thing rather than defending against it. "She used what she knew about you to build a trap," he said. "The word was part of that." "I know." A pause. "I also know she meant it. Both things are true." She looked at him then, and her eyes were very direct, the way they always were when she had decided to say the thing rather than the version of the thing. "I spent 3 years married to you, trying to figure out which parts of what I felt were mine and which parts had been arranged. I still don't have a clean answer." He held her gaze. "Neither do I." A surprised stillness in her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I chose you," he said. "But I chose you inside a context that was designed. And I don't know how to separate what I would have chosen from what I was pointed toward. And I've been trying to work that out for 9 days, and I haven't gotten there." He looked at the fountain. "What I can tell you is that the feeling isn't suspect to me. It doesn't feel arranged, but I understand that my assessment of my own feelings isn't the thing you need." She was quiet for a moment. Mara made a sound of triumph or complaint, indistinguishable at this age, and Elena leaned forward automatically and adjusted the thing in her hands, a small automatic correction, and Mara subsided. "Tell me something," Elena said, "and don't give me the managed version." "All right." "When you were sitting in your office those first weeks after I left, when you were trying to find me and couldn't, what were you actually feeling?" He considered the question the way she'd asked for it, without the managed version, without the retrospective framing he'd built around that period to make it habitable, just what it had actually been. "Like the floor had been removed," he said. "Not loss exactly, more like a structural failure. Something I'd been standing on wasn't there. And I didn't know how I'd been standing on it in the first place, and I didn't know what I'd been building on top of something I'd never tested." He paused. "And then I was angry at myself for that, because I don't build on untested foundations. Except I had." She looked at him. "And then I was angry at you," he said, "for a long time, because anger was more useful than the other thing." "What was the other thing?" "Fear," he said, "that I had been exactly the kind of man who deserved to be left." The fountain moved. A couple with a dog passed on the path in front of them. Mara had found a new source of interest in a fold of the stroller fabric and was examining it with the thorough attention of a scientist who has discovered a new material. "You weren't," Elena said. quiet. Not reassurance, something more careful than reassurance, the voice of a person making a specific and bounded claim rather than a general one. You were distracted. You were consumed by your work in a way that left very little room. You trusted people you shouldn't have trusted, and some of that was because they'd arranged to be trusted, and some of it was because it was easier to manage your empire than to manage what was in your own house. She paused. But you weren't a bad man. You were an absent one. There's a difference. He let that sit. I could have come to you sooner, she said. I've thought about that a lot in the last 9 days. If I had trusted you enough to come to you with what I found, even the partial version, even the early version before I had the full documentation, you would have investigated. You would have found it. She looked at the fountain. But I didn't trust you enough. I trusted my own ability to manage the situation more than I trusted your ability to handle an uncomfortable truth. And that's mine to own. The circumstances were real, and they also don't fully explain it. She turned back to him. I want to be honest about that, because I'm tired of carrying things without naming them. He looked at her. The woman who had been 19 days inside a crisis with him, from the charity gala to this bench, and had not once, even at the most extreme moments, been less than exactly herself. Frightened, controlled, calculating, tender with her daughter, precise with her words, and absolutely, relentlessly honest in the moments when honesty was the most expensive option available. He had spent 3 years married to her and hadn't understood the full scale of that until now. I want to be involved, he said, with Mara, not as a concept, present, regular, consistent. He held her gaze. I know I haven't earned that yet in any way that should matter to her. She doesn't know me, but I want to build that. Whatever the structure looks like, whatever you need it to look like to feel safe, I want to be in it. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She's been asking about you, she said. He stilled. She doesn't have the word for it yet. She points at the door sometimes. She did it last night and this morning. Elena's voice was very even. She saw you twice and she's looking for you. I don't know what that means developmentally, and I don't want to construct too much around it, but she stopped. You should know that. He looked at Mara, who was, at this particular moment, looking back at him with the dark-eyed, unguarded focus she'd had in the charity gala ballroom and in his building lobby. The gaze of a child who had not yet learned to curate what her face revealed, who looked at a thing with the full force of her attention without reservation. He felt the stone in his chest shift again. The same shift as the lobby, but slower now, more permanent. Okay, he said, quietly, to himself as much as to Elena. Okay, Elena said. They sat for another 20 minutes. They didn't fill the silence with anything. The fountain moved, and the city made its ambient sounds around them, and Mara eventually fell asleep in the stroller with the boneless suddenness of very young children, and the bench held them at their careful distance, and it was not resolved, and it was not simple, and it was not the ending of anything so much as the beginning of something that didn't have a shape yet. When they stood to leave, Elena reached into the stroller's undercarriage and took out a small manila envelope and held it out to him. What is this? He said. The original prenuptial agreement. Sandra's version, the one with the buried language. I had a copy. She looked at the envelope in her hand. I thought you might want to be the one to decide what happens to it. He took it, looked at it. It was not heavy. Just paper, just language, just the artifact of a plan that had taken 9 years to build and 9 days to dismantle. He walked to the nearest waste bin and dropped it in. Elena watched him do this without expression. Then she turned the stroller and began walking back toward the park's east exit, and he fell into step beside her. Not close, not separated, just parallel. Two people walking in the same direction at the same pace, which was not the same as walking together, but was, he thought, the closest honest approximation of it available at this particular moment. The weeks that followed had the texture of work, not the dramatic work of crisis, the quiet, repeated, unglamorous work of someone trying to build something correctly after having built it wrong the first time. He restructured Vale Industries from the inside out. not as a corrective measure or a PR strategy, but because the process of reading Harlan's files had shown him, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly which walls had been load-bearing and which had been facades. And he was no longer interested in facades. He brought in 3 new executives from outside his existing network, people with no prior connection to anyone in the old structure. He reduced the Shadow Operational Division to a fraction of its former scope, transferring most of those functions into above-board channels, where they became slower and less efficient and more auditable, which was the point. Marcus Hale pled guilty to 7 counts. The sentencing came 4 months after the gala, and it was unremarkable in the way that these things were: a number of years, a set of conditions, a courtroom with fluorescent lighting, and people in suits saying things in the careful language of institutional consequence. Adrian was not there. He had given his deposition months earlier and had no need to be present, and being present would have looked like something it wasn't. Sandra Oi's case was more complex, as Sandra herself had ensured it would be. She had constructed her exposure with the same precision she'd brought to the construction of the legal framework, meaning that extracting conviction from it was going to take the federal prosecutors longer than any of them wanted. Adrian's attorneys estimated 18 months before a plea or a trial. He noted this and set it aside and stopped tracking it, because tracking it was a form of attention that the case did not deserve more of. Rourke's cooperation agreement held. He disappeared into the mechanism of federal witness arrangements, which had its own geography, its own timeline, and none of it required Adrian's attention. Cora Cross was sentenced to 4 years. She would serve a portion of that, the attorneys said, given her age and the terms of her cooperation. Adrian did not tell Elena this when he found out. He waited, and 2 days later Elena told him she'd heard, and he said, "How are you with it?" And she said, "Working on it." And he said, "Okay." And neither of them needed more than that. He saw Mara every Tuesday and Thursday. This had been Elena's initial offer: 2 days, specific hours, a handoff arrangement that was formal enough to protect Mara's routine and flexible enough to allow for the unpredictability of a child's schedule. He had accepted it without negotiating, which Elena had noted with a slight, unreadable expression. The first few visits were careful. Mara was 22 months old and then 23, and the world she lived in was made of textures and sounds and the reliable presence of specific people, and Adrian was not yet a specific person to her. He was a recurring stranger, which was its own category. He brought nothing to the visits. He arrived at the time Elena specified, and he sat on the floor or the couch or wherever Mara currently was, and he made himself available without demand, and he waited. On the 4th Tuesday, Mara climbed into his lap without preamble. She had been carrying a board book, a small thing with animals on thick cardboard pages, and she settled into his lap with the focused purposefulness of someone who had decided on a thing and was executing it, and she opened the book on her knees and pointed at the first animal. "Da," she said, which was her word for several things he'd been told. It covered a range of meanings. He looked at the picture she was pointing at. An elephant. "Elephant," he said. She pointed at it again. "Elephant," he said again. She turned the page. "A giraffe." She pointed. They went through the entire book. It took 9 minutes. When they finished the last page, she turned it over and started again from the beginning, and he sat there on the floor of Elena's temporary apartment with Mara's weight in his lap and her small finger directing his attention to each animal in sequence. And he said each name when she pointed, and the morning light moved across the floor, and it was the most ordinary 9 minutes he had spent in years, and he felt it with the full weight of everything it had cost to arrive here. Elena watched from the kitchen doorway for part of it. She had a mug, and she wasn't drinking from it, just holding it. When he looked up and found her watching, she didn't look away or rearrange her expression. And what was on her face was not simple, but it was real. And real was enough. 3 months after the gala, Adrian found a permanent apartment. Not the tower. He'd sold it, a decision that surprised even Damon, though Damon had the sense not to say so. The new place was smaller, in a neighborhood with a park nearby, with a second bedroom that he furnished without elaborate deliberation, but with care. A bed the right size, shelves at the right height, a window that caught morning light. He didn't tell Elena about the second bedroom. He wasn't ready to make a claim on what it meant. She found out when she brought Mara to his apartment for the first time, 2 weeks after he'd moved in. She walked through, doing the thing people do in new spaces, reading the room, taking inventory. And she opened the wrong door and stood in the doorway of the second bedroom and looked at it for a moment without speaking. He stood behind her. I know what it is, she said. She was quiet for another moment. It's a good window, she said. He said, that's why I chose it. She turned around and looked at him, and there was something in her face that had been building for 3 months. Not resolved, not simple, still carrying the weight of everything they'd been through and everything that had been done to them and everything they'd done themselves, but present and moving and pointed in a direction. I'm not ready, she said, to say things I'm not sure of yet. I know. I need more time. I have time, he said. Elena, I have time. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to where Mara was investigating his kitchen with the thorough destructive curiosity of a child approaching 2 years old, and the sound of her daughter's discoveries filled the apartment, and Adrian stood in the hallway between the kitchen and the second bedroom and breathed. He thought about the photograph in the old safe, his grandfather, tall and dark-suited, the birthmark on his shoulder, the expression that people had always said looked like Adrian's own. He'd had it reframed. It was on the wall of the new office, in a corner where he'd see it when he looked up from the desk, and he looked at it most mornings and thought about what it meant to be made of something that passed through people, through time, through the choices that built a life and the choices that damaged one, and came out the other side still carrying the mark. He thought about Harlan, less often now than in the first weeks, but with more clarity. Not grief. He'd moved through a version of grief for the trust more quickly than he'd expected, because the trust had been the thing that was lost, not Harlan himself, and the loss of trust had its own timeline that didn't require the loss of the person to be complete. He thought about the 9 years and the architecture and the elegant patience of a man who had spent a decade building something inside the thing Adrian was building, a counterstructure, a shadow structure, waiting. He thought about what it meant that he hadn't seen it. He had decided, without theater, that not seeing it did not make him a fool. It made him a person who had trusted deeply inside a context designed to exploit deep trust. And the correct response to that was not to stop trusting, but to become more deliberate about where trust was placed and on what it was founded. He thought this was true. Some mornings it felt true. Some mornings it felt like the thing you told yourself so you could get up. On a Thursday in November, 4.5 months after the gala, he and Elena sat on a bench in the same park where they'd had the first real conversation. Mara was on the path in front of them, moving in the deliberate and somewhat chaotic way of a child who had recently become confident in walking and was testing the confidence against every surface available. The air was cold. Their breath came out in small, visible exhalations. My attorney says the case file will be fully closed in another 8 months, Elena said. Mine says the same. After that, she stopped, turned her coffee cup. After that, there's no remaining legal structure connecting us except Mara. Yes, he said. She looked at him directly. What do you want? He held her gaze. He thought about giving her the careful version. He thought about the managed answer. The answer that protected him from the vulnerability of saying the full thing before the full thing was certain to be received. He gave her the full thing. You, he said, and Mara. A life that looks like the one we almost had, built this time on the actual ground instead of a false floor. I know that's not a small ask. I know you have reasons to want nothing complicated from me. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm answering your question. She looked at him for a long time. Mara reached the edge of the path and stopped at the grass border with a toddler's instinctive caution at a texture change, and looked back at them both. At her mother, and then at Adrian, with the same frank, unguarded assessment she'd always given him. The gaze that had not changed since the first time he'd seen her across a ballroom floor, before he knew her name or her face or the weight of what her existence meant. Then she stepped off the path onto the grass and kept walking. Okay, Elena said. He looked at her. I'm not saying everything is resolved, she said. I'm not saying I know how this goes. I'm saying... She paused. I'm saying okay, to trying, to letting this be something instead of nothing. He exhaled. long and slow, the breath of a man who had been holding something in his chest for 5 years and a little longer. Something that had gone from grief to anger to efficiency to the kind of numb forward motion that passes for healing when you're not doing the actual work, and had arrived here, at this bench, at this woman, at this particular Tuesday in November, at the very ordinary fact of being present in a life he had very nearly lost before he understood its value. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the bench between them. Not a dramatic gesture, not a claim, just a hand, on a bench, on a cold morning, covering the hand of the person sitting beside him. She turned her hand over, didn't take his hand, just turned hers so that the contact was mutual rather than one-directional. They sat like that and watched Mara move across the grass toward the fountain, her small figure navigating the distance with the particular concentrated determination of a child who has decided where she is going and requires no assistance getting there. The birthmark on her left shoulder was hidden under her coat. He knew it was there. He would always know it was there, not as a secret and not as a revelation, but as the thing that had started all of this, the mark that had crossed a ballroom and cracked open 5 years of silence and set in motion everything that had hurt, and everything that had finally, at considerable cost, been made honest. Some things you pass down without meaning to. Some of them are good. He looked at his daughter moving through the cold morning air toward the sound of the fountain, and he looked at the woman beside him with her hand turned open on the bench, and he did not think about what came next, not the weeks, or the legal conclusions, or the slow architecture of trust being rebuilt in a new place. He just sat. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, the sitting was enough.